Hello, I'm Rory McKiernan, author of Hitching for Hope, and you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. I'm coming to you from here in Lahinch, County Clare on the magical wild west coast of Ireland. Great to be going out across the world to listeners in over 50 countries. And a very special welcome to new listeners. Please do check out the archives when you finish this episode. And a genuine heartfelt thank you, as always, to all you wonderful patrons and supporters who chip in to support the podcast over at loveandcourage.org. I'm delighted to welcome John Connell back to the podcast. This is his second time on the Love and Courage podcast, and it was great to catch up with him. John is a multi-award winning best-selling author, journalist, producer and farmer. He writes a weekly column for the Irish Independent newspaper and lives and works in Longford in the Irish Midlands. His newest book is called The Stream of Everything. I absolutely love that title, and unsurprisingly it's a bestseller, as were his previous two books, The Running Book and The Cow Book. John is a deep thinking man with plenty of insightful stories and reflections to share, and I'd encourage you to check out the previous episode with John from September 2020. Now remember, if you're new to the podcast, please do subscribe for updates on your podcast app, and you can get updates from me on social media. Just look me up, Rory McKiernan, or from my email newsletter, which is at loveandcourage.org. And for now though, let's jump in. I'm sure you're keen to get started, so let's begin with this latest Love and Courage conversation with John Connell. John, you're very welcome back to the podcast. I have to say there's not that many people have found their way back to the podcast just by virtue of having new people, but it's nice to have old friends back. So thanks for joining me. How are you keeping?
I'm good, Rory. It's great to be back. It's been about 2 years since I spoke to you, so lots has happened, and I suppose we've come through a global lockdown, and a pandemic seems to have moved into the background a little bit. So it's been a minute.
Yeah, so there you go. Like, I can't remember the specific date that we talked, but I don't know, was the pandemic kicking off? Interesting. There's a lot to to possibly unpack in a 2-year window of the world, but particularly keen to hear what's going on in your personal window into the world. And I think the new book, which we'll talk about shortly, is going to be a large part of that. But I'm also minded, John, from our previous conversation, that you moved home from Australia, and I just have that sense of you, and I've read some of your articles in the newspaper and so on, that perhaps all that time abroad gave you the kind of bigger eyes to look at the world, but also to look back in Ireland. So I'm wondering, I think you're back 6 or 7 years now, and how has the journey home been for you? Have you returned with a new look in general, and have you fully settled, or do you find yourself kind of looking out the window again?
Yeah, it's I've just been writing a book, and it's all about that notion of we're a new person every 7 years, and you have new skin, new cells. We're entirely a new being. And coming home, I was in Australia in 2015, and I said to my then girlfriend, now wife, that I was going to go home to Ireland to write a book, and I'd be back in 2 months. And the book writing took 2 years. and I suppose I had to reroute myself in Ireland. It was an enormous journey, because I suppose I was changing myself. I'd come through my mental health difficulties and had re-engaged with life in terms of not drinking, taking up exercise, getting in touch with my faith and spirituality, meditating, all this stuff. And then coming back to the farm, and, I hadn't worked on the farm since I was a teenager. And then I found myself in 2016 working on the farm for lambing and calving season, and ended up writing this, the cow book about it. And it's been a really interesting experience, because I was nearly 10 years out of Ireland. So I had to this is strange, but I was a tourist in my own country, there was a lot of places I'd never been. I'd never been to, like, Dingle, a place I love. I'd never been to Dingle. I'd never climbed Croagh Patrick. I'd never been to Newgrange. All these seminal things like the Hill of Ishnok. I'd never been to any of these places. And I slowly started to become a tourist in my own country. And I've read other, the Irish Times have pieces about people who come back and stuff or who go. And everyone kind of says the same thing. You have to rediscover your home. And I found myself in Longford, and over the years now, the 7 years, I've built a life. We bought a house here last year, and it is home. But I'm still, I suppose, a global citizen. Like at the start of the pandemic, I was in America documenting farm worker rights in the US, and I was due to go to Brazil to look at beef farms. So I suppose Longford has been my base to see the world. And I suppose I realized as well that, I used to think that Australia was the center of the world, but I realize now it's quite far away, and it's quite a distance. And as you get older and your family get older, it's nice to be closer to them.
Yeah. Yeah. That notion of Australia being the center of the world, it's something I've picked up on over the years from being in Australia and talking to friends there. I get a feeling that it sort of might think it's bigger than it is. Now, geographically, that's obviously very true, that it is an enormous place, but it's so remote and isolated and away from the world, so to speak, or at least a large part of the world. And in fact, Ireland can be very much the center of the world, at least geographically. I find, we can be in New York in a few hours, and we can be over in Turkey or Russia, or North Africa, and so many places. But what are your thoughts about Australia at the moment? I know as we record this, there's an election about to take place, but as a country, and I know it's sometimes challenging when we do have loved ones and friends there, we don't want to be necessarily critical, but I suppose we have a critical friend eye on our own country and other countries. But just wondering, where does Australia sit in your heart these days?
It has a very special place in my heart. I talk to Australian friends every week. I follow Australian news. I listen to Australian radio and on podcasts. So I'm still very culturally aware of what's happening there. I suppose I've been following the Australian general election that's happening at the moment, and it has sort of brought up issues that I would have experienced when I was back in Australia in 2015, which is notionally really the cost of living, and how as a society it's become quite an unfair one in many respects, because it's so hard to get your foot on the property ladder there. I was writing an article I write a column in the Irish Independent, and I was writing an article about it this week, and they say that of those born from 1990 onwards, that it's only about a 40 to 50% chance that they'll have a property of their own by the time they hit 40, which is compared to the generation before, which was a 72% chance of you having a house. So it's becoming a society where it's there's long-term renters. It's very hard to get a bit of safety and have your own place. And, they call it the Australian dream. The Australian dream is owning your own house, and it's slipping out of grasp for people. And I remember being there in 2015, and I was working on a building site as an unskilled labourer. I couldn't get work in media, and I did what lots of Irish people did. I took a job in construction, but I realised that if I wanted to try and be a writer, I couldn't afford to live in that city. I couldn't afford to write and to pay rent and everything else. So I came back to Ireland, where things were not so bad. Australia is a great place, but there are issues. I mean, it has to tackle climate change. That's a big issue. It's also, one of the world's biggest suppliers of coal. That has to change. So it's a society, I think, in transition. And this election that's happening as we speak is probably a big deciding factor in the next 10 years of Australian life. Mm-hmm.
There's so much you're talking about there that draws parallels for me anyway to Ireland. I don't know the specific stats, but they're not dissimilar in terms of the trend in demographics between one generation to the next and home ownership in particular. And, obviously the Irish government have made some significant inroads in relation to climate policy, but at the same time, we're building data centres left, right and centre. And I think sometimes we don't see our own maybe complicity in the bigger mess so much. But, just comparing the two countries in that regard in social or economic policy, it just strikes me that increasingly the problems that many of us are facing are global by nature, perhaps, in terms of ideology or, we talk about the Australian dream. We don't necessarily use the terminology, the Irish dream, but, it's that vision for life and how we would like life to be for us and our loved ones, and the decency, the social contract, as some people might call it.
Who can't think of who termed that, Crusoe or yes, there was a famous book called The Social Contract. It's not Cocteau, but anyway. It's a funny world at the moment, I suppose the war in Ukraine really made us realize how globally connected we are. The food shortages that we're hearing about now, that are a knock-on effect of the crops not getting harvested in Ukraine, which will affect Africa, African nations. It's sometimes the world is complex, but it's always been that way. I think people think that the past was a simpler time. It wasn't. It was always just as difficult. It's just now we're so connected and we know what's happening in the rest of the world. We are talking, and there is a war in Europe, and there's millions of refugees fleeing that war. That's a fact that is happening in 2022.
Yeah, you're not wrong there. We're talking about 13 million, I think I read yesterday, is one of the latest figures, 13 million displaced and about 6 million refugees out of Ukraine, straight all around Europe, and 30,000 here in Ireland so far. And just to hear where I am in rural County Clare, over 1,000, actually significantly over 1,000 Ukrainian refugees. In the town of Listun, Varna, it's a population around 800. And there were already 200 asylum seekers there, and there are now 1,000 Ukrainians on top of that. So It's like the influence of global turbulence is coming to bear in all corners. But I like that historical lens, John, where I was reading about the Chinese warship doing a kind of maneuver around the west coast of Australia the other day, and previous to that, we've the American warship, and before that, the British warship. And, in the past, we had Portuguese, Spanish, French. I suppose that comes down to an interest, I know is one of yours, is colonialism. And, effectively, there's power struggles at play at all times. And I suppose resources is often a big part of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think... colonialism nowadays, it's not getting in your Nina, Pita and Santa Maria and sailing to the Americas, or Pizarro or Cortez. It can be economic, and it can be soft power, and it can be hard power and influence in a nation. Yeah, it's an interesting prospect, because we are seeing an America that seems to be struggling and a China that is growing, and there are world powers emerging, and some are retreating. And then I was listening to the radio yesterday, and they were talking about the fact that we have dictators still in the world and still raging wars. So colonialism, to my mind, never really left. It just changed its form.
Yeah,
I think. I'm no expert on it. I wrote a book about British colonialism, but I think that there are new forms of colonialism, and you don't need to send in an army to influence the politics in a country anymore.
You're not wrong there. You can have an army of bots on Twitter informing elections in various countries. And indeed, we saw here in our own country a debate over the National Maternity Hospital, and we had bots in Istanbul or Turkey and retweeting tweets on it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And the question is who paid for the bots and so on and so forth. And it's a murky world. But going back to your own life, John, we'll come to your new book shortly, but I just want to get a sense of where you're at and, what's life like in the new house, and are you still farming, and what are your days looking like?
Yeah, it's, Rory, you and I, when we talk, we have always very deep talks, and we're going in.
I'm just warming you up. I'm warming you up gently, John.
We're forming our old pattern here, but no, I suppose, Rory, one of my greatest fears in life was to be homeless when I was a young person. Don't know why, it just was a fear. So getting the house was a really, it was a big dream come true, and it felt earthy. So what have I been doing for the last while? I spent 6 months writing a book, and then in January I finished it, and I've spent the last months farming. I bought some sheep. I was delivering lambs, working on the farm, delivering calves, and not doing any book writing. And it actually was probably a great experience because, I talked to different writers about this, and a lot of people talk about the notion of like a rested field. I keep a field fallow for a year and let it rest. And that experience was really good. And it actually opened me up to a lot of new thinking. And I've been reading a lot of like spiritual literature from different writers like Thomas Merton or Henry Nouwen, and becoming increasingly interested in ecological theology. And I think in a way that is because I'm on the land and I'm rooted in the land, and I am a spiritual person. And I was trying to, uncover what is there a crossroads between spirituality and the earth, and of course there is, and there's vast literature on it, and it's been a really interesting few months. And I suppose it was a time to unwind a little bit and get back into the real world, and I found it to be really beneficial. And as someone who has had mental health difficulties in the past, I have to look after myself, and so actually slowing down has been a really important thing. And I think in a sense that COVID taught us all to slow down a little bit. I know that the world is getting a bit busy again. I know that for example, people are back commuting to Dublin and back in offices. But I think that despite the tragedy of COVID and the loss of life, which was a terrible thing, and we lost loved ones, but if we could take the lesson of slowing down from it, I think that it would be an enormous benefit to us, I don't know if that was your experience, but it certainly was mine. I would write during the day, and then I'd go and look at the sheep or the cattle, and then I'd go for a run. And in a way, I was living a life that was so much more similar to my grandparents, that your parish, your townland was your whole world, and I remember, one of the first trips back to Dublin, for whatever reason it was, I don't remember now, but it seemed like an awful long way to go, something that I had done multiple times a week. It seemed like this enormous journey, and it made me realize that I had rerouted into this little townland and gotten used to it.
Well, there's so much in that, John, and I'm I was chatting to a local farmer recently, and I was talking about a trip to Dublin I'd made recently, and like that, saying almost an ordeal it was.
Yeah,
but he said to me, I was in Dublin once and I didn't think much of it, but I was just really struck by the fact that he said he was there once. Yeah. And this is a man could be touching 60, and I thought that was fantastic, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I suppose growing up, the ideal was always to go everywhere. And I love that idea of knowing yourself first and knowing the parish or the surrounds that are around you. And if you can't know your own place, then, you know, it's
kind of a, you know, Rory, I'm someone who's traveled all over the world. There's a few places I need to go to for work, but as I get older now, I'm 35, I want to travel increasingly less. It's kind of a funny thing, you know. I for a couple of years there, I was all over the world, traveling every month for work, and now I am glad to be in one place for an extended period of time. And I was on the Camino last year, and it was interesting, very spiritual experience, very, very, very powerful. But it wasn't until I came to Galicia where the Camino ends, and they call themselves Celtic people, and it felt like walking through home. And I said to myself, you know, I think I'm gonna go back home now and really appreciate it. And it was weird. It was like going to another land, but coming to see yourself, meeting yourself on the walk, and meeting your own people. And I remember having a chat. My Spanish isn't brilliant, but my comprehension is good. And having a chat with the bus driver, and him saying to me, "We're Celtic brothers." And
lovely.
You know, it was a really special experience, and something that, traveling in the Celtic world, it was a nice experience.
I hear a new book title coming on there.
Yeah, maybe.
The irony here, it's going to be a travel book. No, you've mentioned spirituality a few times, John, and like, I just can't always get this sense here, you know, that in another era or culture or place, you would have been a priest.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the truth is, Rory, I was, when I lived in Canada in 2014, I went through probably a year of thinking that I would be a priest. And I was in a relationship and said it to my partner, but really was very close to it. But I've found as I've, you know, and ultimately I didn't enter seminary. I chose, as my friend who's a priest actually calls it, the ministry of the word, which is writing. And as I've gotten older, my spirituality has deepened, my faith has deepened. And, you know, I increasingly find great comfort in having a spiritual life, which is something that I wouldn't have had in my 20s. I wouldn't have engaged with it. Maybe I went to Mass on Christmas Day or, you know, Easter, something like that in Australia. But it has grown and deepened. And in a sense, I think discovering a Clare man, John O'Donoghue, really opened me up to Celtic spirituality, and realizing that, you know, we have a deep spirit base in this country. You don't have to go to Tibet to get in contact with our own deep understanding of the world. And, you know, seeing, as a farmer as well, seeing God in nature is a beautiful thing. You know, I continually feel the cry of creation when you deliver a new lamb, or there's a calf comes into the world, or just seeing, you know, like the crescendo of grass. I was writing something, I was talking about the symphony of nature and the crescendo of grass and the symbols of trees, symbols in the musical sense. But I suppose that's why I did the Camino, you know. That's, to be honest, I wanted to experience that world. But I think ultimately you come to meet yourself on the Camino. And I remember meeting a NASA engineer and on the walk, and I said, "Have you got your message yet?" Everybody talks about messages, you know.
Okay,
and she said no, and I said, "Well, I think actually you bring your answer with you." And the woman stopped walking and looked at me, and she was like, "I never thought of it like that." And I said, "It only came to me." I said, "But I think the answer's inside you." I said, "The Camino is just a vehicle to allow you to think about it, but you have the answer already." And that's kind of what the Camino is all about. You meet people and you have these exchanges, and sometimes there's a little moment of epiphany.
It's lovely. And speaking about the likes of John O'Donoghue and, another man before him or around the same time as John Moriarty, and
Oh, yeah.
you referenced Celtic spirituality, but at the heart of all of that was a more ecological resonance, perhaps. And, going back to Australia with the Indigenous people, and, ultimately Indigenous people everywhere have earth-based spirituality, and perhaps something was cut off, either lost or intentionally cut off along the way, that could perhaps be at the heart of so much of the dysfunction and disconnection that we experience economically, socially, culturally.
Yeah.
This is where it's at.
Yeah, I think, you have the modern world is so hard and so taxing that people have to go, like, this is the truth. People have to go on retreats from the modern world to get a bit of equilibrium in their life. So does that not raise the question of, well, what sort of a society is this that you have to get away from the society to get back to yourself, and you'll pay lots of money to take a break and then go back, and you've recharged yourself, you go back to be depleted again and then to go to do it again. And there was an interview I heard John O'Donoghue talking about, and he said he had a friend in the UK, and she was totally stressed out, went and took 2 weeks by the sea and relaxed, and was back to herself. But really, isn't it a shame that society is like that we have to take these retreats from it? And it's getting increasingly harder for people. People are holding out on these front lines, and some people never get the chance to have the break because maybe they don't have the money to go to the seaside, or to go to a yoga retreat or a meditation, thing. They don't have that opportunity. It's not part of their life, and they have to just make do with it. And I think, one of my reasons in coming back to Longford was that it was, I knew this world, and it was a quiet world, and that even though everything has to be worked for and everything has to be earned, and I'm no different to anyone else, but that maybe there was a little bit of peace in this world that I wasn't finding in the cities of the world.
Yeah, there's definitely my sense of cities. Obviously, you've touched on busyness, but I mean, they many ways are the hotbeds of culture and ideas, and that I think is to be celebrated, and I love it. But they're also kind of hotbeds of consumption and capitalism and sort of dog eat dog mentality. Now, I'm not saying that in rural Ireland everything's all rosy and everybody's all sort of morally superior or cleaner. But I suppose having that spaciousness around you and in your own head, you can be less perhaps contaminated by whatever toxicity might be in the culture. Although the internet can challenge that as well, in that you have the smartphone going into the 10-year-old's bedroom now. So yeah, I suppose where this is bringing me is to think about the notion of simplicity, and perhaps, when we talk about world religions, that seems to be at the heart of so many of them, is to simplify. But the race at the moment is complexity. It's add more strings to your bow, not less.
Yeah, I suppose, Rory, I'm at a stage now where I'm not interested in intensive things. I'm interested in slow things, and maybe it was going on the river with the book, slowing down. We were going at about maybe 2 or 3 miles an hour in a canoe, and I started to read a lot of Lao Tzu at the time, and he talks a lot about rivers, and the Chinese philosopher, and he talks about the notion of a river meeting a big rock, and that the river is a gentle force, and will flow around the rock, and eventually, after maybe 1,000 years, will flow through the rock. But everything is achieved, and I think about that notion a lot. That, on the farm, let's say we have a busy day with sheep, they have to be dosed or sheared or whatever it is, or moved, and I could just say, I'll be a river now meeting the rock, and I'll go slowly, and in going slowly, the job is done, and it's done at a calmer pace, as opposed to trying to rush through it and ultimately not getting the job done properly. And and I think, slowing down is probably what we need to do in this world. And that we can be the river. We can be the river.
Well put. I love that. Bringing Lao Tzu to ancient Chinese philosophy into the rivers of Longford, and and why not? And the chances are we had our own similar understanding of all of that, but we perhaps didn't have the same written culture or for whatever reason, we don't have those written texts that speak in that same way. But perhaps it's a positive of globalization to an extent, where we do have greater access to see the commonality.
Yeah. This is the wonderful thing about the internet and being able to order books, that you can read all this stuff, and take it in and watch a documentary on it. So, that's the powerful thing about the modern world, that ideas are so accessible and can be shared. And I think that's where we see the positives of technology and the positives of the modern world. I know we were saying that cities are, tough places, but we are living at the point of peak technology. We've never been as advanced, and similarly, we're living at peak ecological biodiversity, because the further on we go, the lesser that becomes. So we're living in a good time, even though it might not seem it.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem it a lot of the time, particularly from a political or back to ecology. But on the other hand, we are making some inroads in many areas, and like as you said, looking back historically, what time on earth was this kind of rosy picture? There were always sort of marauding tribes, even go back to our Celtic brothers in Spain. There was lads who'd take the head off you wherever you were.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I was listening to an interview with a writer the other day, a military historian, who was talking about evolution and how, when first man developed, we were coming from the primate culture, and the primate culture has always been strife. And he was talking in particular about chimpanzees and how chimpanzees have bands of communities, but there's no man's lands in between different communities, and if you stray into one, you could get killed. And we seem to have brought that strife with us. There's a history of war as our species. There's always been conflict. This is what he was saying, and I'd never thought of it before. So it was an interesting concept, that conflict has been with us for a long time.
Yeah. And I suppose then, therefore, obviously conflict are so often resource-based, but they're also, it's often said that conflict begins and ends in the hearts and minds of men or women, but often men. And, the opposite of that is peace, and sort of a peaceful heart. And I want to go back to the river and into the boat and the canoe, and I have this real sense of a peaceful voyage. Can you talk to me about the voyage and how it became the book?
So I was in America and talking to migrant farm workers, and I came back and the lockdown started. I was back probably a week, and I hadn't really heard anything because I'd been on the road for about a month and hadn't been following news. So I didn't really know anything about the pandemic. But as it happened, I found myself in Longford, and my friend Peter Gagan, a journalist, was home from Scotland. And I had this idea to go on the canoe down the Camlin. See, the story was I had nearly drowned on Sydney Harbour 10 years before, and I had made this promise to myself that one day I'd make a little trip down the Camlin in thanks for my life being spared. And it just seemed like the perfect time. And I suggested it to Peter. And Peter said, why not, So it was this 2-day trip down our Ganges, down this small river. And, Rory, I'm probably someone that's traveled all their life, but it was one of the most amazing trips I've ever been on. There was so much wildlife. Look in the water, there was fish swimming around you, swans, herons, kingfishers, mayfly. I seen mayfly for the first. I'd never seen mayfly in my life, and there they were on the river, quietly, going about their existence, and they only live for a day or so. And the trout were jumping to catch them. It was this amazing experience, and it was a joyful experience. And I suppose for me, I had been carrying a lot of the wounds from the past, from the 7 years and the years prior to it. And I said to myself that I'm going to go down the river, and by the time we get to Clondra, which is where the Camlin meets the Shannon, I'm going to leave my problems on this river. And I had this image of the problems flowing out into the Shannon, all the way down to Limerick, and then flowing out into the Atlantic. And the amazing thing was, it was this cathartic trip, and it was this cathartic experience, and it did work. And I sometimes think that we need grand gestures in life. I was talking to a friend recently who quit smoking, and I said, "What did you do to mark it?" And he said, "I smashed every ashtray in the house." And my marker was to go down that river to say goodbye. I realized when I was on the river, I realized I'd been thinking about stuff for 7 to 10 years. It's a long time to be thinking about things. And eventually I let them go. And it was powerful.
When you said thinking about stuff, I get a real sense of rumination, that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was total rumination. And, rumination, we don't talk about it enough in the media. Like, we all ruminate, but when rumination can be crippling. And I think rumination is, it's a bedfellow of anxiety and depression. But there are people who are prisoners to their thoughts. And it can be very hard. And I'm someone who was one of those, it can be very hard to dispel those thoughts and see them for what they just are. A thought that comes in, stays there for a moment, and then goes again. But if you don't have the tools to deal with them, they can be crippling. Yeah,
and they're so often not only, of course, but so often connected to sort of aspects of guilt or shame or regret and things that happen to us. And I suppose then, implicit in rumination is an element of inactivity, or not necessarily catalyzing them towards transforming the thoughts into anything constructive other than this horrific, terrible car going around a terrible roundabout at a slow, terrible speed.
Yeah. And Rory, for me, I've wrote 3 memoirs, and there isn't any more, but they're done now. But that was my way of dispelling the past and dealing, not just dispelling it, but actually examining it, analysing it, processing it, and then letting it go. And it took 3 books to really make sense of 10 years of living. And those books were books that were about loss and the loss of love, and about depression and sadness. But ultimately, with the stream of everything, I realized as I was writing it, it was a book about love and happiness. And, I suppose I finished by talking about my wife and the love that she has brought into my life. And I realized that the journey had a happy ending. And I think for people who can know, I think it serves as a good lesson for people to know that life works out. And I was doing a talk for a group of secondary school girls recently, and they asked me, I was telling them my life story, and then they said, "What happened with the girlfriend?" I said, I'm married to her. And that was the bit they loved the most, because they said, it showed them that love has a way to conquer everything. And your podcast is called Love and Courage. It really can be a discounted thing, because love can move mountains, really, literally and figuratively.
Yeah, and that's if there isn't love on the agenda, then what are we at?
Yeah.
I'd actually, it's a word that you don't really hear in common parlance. Like, it's not, if we do a Google News search for love in the media today, there's not going to be much about it other than sort of trivial stuff or celebrity, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's amazing, to imagine perhaps a new political discourse that spoke to the common values of humanity. Now, I think increasingly politicians maybe do go there, and perhaps there's an element of the conditioning of masculinity and our political system being very much a male-orientated one, and thankfully changing, but slowly. And perhaps with that change might come an opening up of the heart. And, you know, the reality is that many or most, or certainly a lot of men have been conditioned from a very young age to not talk about love as something important in our worlds. We're there to conquer.
Yeah, it's, you know, Ocean Vuong, he's a Vietnamese American poet. He's a new poetry collection out called Time is a Mother, but he has a poem in it that deals with toxic masculinity, and he's talking about even the language we use in the business world. You slayed that, you dominated him, you killed him.
Killed it,
you know? Yeah, you killed it. All these very aggressive terms. And you're right, Rory, people don't talk about love. And I know I have a few friends and male friends, and they would have told me they loved me. And it took me a long time to be able to say that back, to say, well, I love you too, you know, and that's going against the grain of, you know, being a farmer's son and coming from a farming family for generations, that you don't talk about those things. And, you know, I recently interviewed my mother, and she was telling me about her father giving her a penny when she was a little girl. And that was that generation's way of saying, I love you and you're doing well, you know. We showed it in different ways. There still, of course, was love, but I think it's, you know, building modern men, they have to be capable of dealing with that notion and that power, because it's a very lonely world if you don't have love in your life. And you know, love takes many forms, but it's a very lonely world if it isn't there. And maybe that's what leads to these acts of violence that we see. You know, I'm thinking of Buffalo in New York the other day, the shooting, the racist attack and the shooting there. And there was a man who was influenced by the New Zealand attack, and men with a lack of love in their life, looking to an online community to find it, and then it being contorted into an aggressive thing.
Yeah, it's often a way with radicalization and any form of sort of supremacy, whether it be Islamic fundamentalism or white supremacy, that they're young men in search of belonging. And it's the same in gang culture as well, you know, that if we can bring people into the village and give them a sense of belonging and purpose. And I think that has to start with work with young people, because I suppose also you see a lot of the narrative around young people being that they're wild and they're untamed and they're wrecking the place and this, that and the other. But, you know, it's our duty as, you know, the adults in the society to create and facilitate the spaces, as you are involved in there with that talk with the teenagers. You know, I think that's so important to build that intergenerational dialogue where, you know, because I'm sure you got as much or more out of that as you gave.
You know, I actually do a lot of motivational speaking, and I don't advertise it. I never seek it out, but it has found me since the Cow book came out. And you know, I do a talk probably once a month, and it's there's a strength in being open. You know, John O'Donoghue's talked about a beauty coming from woundedness, but I think there's also a beauty that comes from being open. You know, it was funny talking to the girls. I said to them, I don't look young, do I? And they said, no. And I was like, okay, I'm not a young fella anymore. But I want, that wasn't the mission. I wanted them to remember that even when things are bad, that there's always a light to hold on to. And, you know, I said to them, you're going out into the world now. And I said, maybe you'll never remember this talk. I said, but if you can take away one thing. And I got them to do this little exercise. And I do it with most secondary school kids I do talks with. I get them to close their eyes and just be calm for a moment and think about the problem they're worrying about, whether it's the leaving cert or the junior cert. And then to to think about all the people that love them in their life, their parents or their guardians, their friends, their cousins, and their teachers. And I do say, look at all the people in your mind who want the best for you. So really the problem isn't going to be that hard, and if we could all do that little exercise now and again, I think we'd be able to look after ourselves a little bit more, because all we ultimately want for each other is the best outcome for someone, whether they're doing their leaving cert or they're taking their driving lessons. We want them to have a positive outcome, to feel that they're wanted and needed in life.
Yeah, I find it's interesting what I'm going to say to you now, but part of me disagrees with you.
Go for it. Yeah.
No, well, I don't at all, to be honest. I think yes, that's true. Except elements of that culture that we referred to before, of the slaying, the dominating, the crushing, the killing it. It's very much the hunter-gatherer. I'm going out into the jungle today. I'm going to take the head of somebody, because if I don't, my world is under threat, like that highly competitive world. So I think it's an entirely different world than the one you're talking about.
No, it is. No, and I agree with you. I agree with you. What I suppose, Roy, what I was saying is that's what I want when I do the talks.
I know what you're saying. I suppose I'm
but you're right. There is that whole other aggressive world, and we need an ego to be in the world. First of all, like you need an ego, a healthy ego to get outside the door. But that aggressive thing, that's where it gets tricky,
Well, okay, just touch on that now, because like my experience of just one book, for instance, but multiple projects and things that, have to build or get out into the world, it sort of does require some element of that healthy ego stuff to push yourself forward or propel yourself. And, if at some point you realize that, well, if I don't do it, nobody's coming here to do it for me,
Yeah.
And how do you navigate that now, John? Or have you got a kind of a stride that how to, the drill and the dance? Or do you still have to kind of get into what is often known as the hustle?
Yeah, I mean, I still hustle. I'm like anyone else. I want want to do certain things in life, and you have to put yourself out there to do them, whether it's writing a book or writing a play or whatever it is. And I think I try, when I do those things, to back myself, and that, the worst that anyone can say to you in relation to your creative work is no. But then they're not going to think any more about it. They're not going to think about it in 2 weeks and go, I'm really glad I said no to that guy. They're just going to go about their life. So you have to develop a thick skin and say, well, actually, I've published this book. It didn't sell, or it didn't work, or I made a movie and it didn't work the way I wanted it to work. But I failed, but I'll fail again and fail better, and I'll start again and do something new. And backing yourself. And I think that's what I was talking about with the school kids, is that you have to have the ego to get ahead in life, but you also need to have the bit of self-love to be able to say it worked or it didn't work, and to know that you pick yourself up again and try again. And, I think that we go through loads of phases in our life, and maybe I'm in a reflective space at the moment, but I still have to get out there and talk to people, And you need a healthy ego to do that. And if you don't have a healthy ego, you won't be able to interact with people on the street on a simple level. But we have to manage the ego so that it maintains in a healthy ego, that it doesn't go into this aggressive kill, slay thing, because that's where it can be hurtful,
Yeah, and going back to Lao Tzu, the Tao of knowing when to push forward and when to pull back. And so if you're in a reflective phase today, maybe next month or next year, you're back on the horse and you're riding around northern Spain, writing your next book or whatever it is. Yeah. Well, listen, I've no doubt we'll end up having a part 3 at some stage. Go for the trilogy, since you're the trilogy king. But I've really enjoyed the chat, John, and look forward to following what's next for you. And no doubt many more adventures to come, whether to be local or global or internal or wherever they end up.
Yeah, got to keep moving forward.
Good man. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rory.
Hello, Rory here again. A huge thanks to John for that really rich conversation and for sharing so many great insights and stories. Be sure to check out his books and keep an eye out for his newspaper columns and other great work. If you know others who might like to hear this episode, please do send them a link and mention it on social media if you feel so inclined. You can also help the podcast reach more people by subscribing in your podcast app. You'll get updates on new episodes, and also ratings and reviews are all appreciated. And a huge thanks to existing podcast patrons for chipping in. And if you'd like to chip in, you can go over to loveandcourage.org, even if it's a once-off small chip in or a monthly basis. That all is appreciated. It helps the podcast grow and reach new people, helps me promote it to new listeners all around the world. And if you're new to the podcast, be sure to check out the archive. Lots of great stuff in there, and you might enjoy my book if you haven't come across it yet. It's called Hitching for Hope. Huge thanks to everyone for listening, for being part of the Love and Courage community. Thanks again for all your love and support. Until next time.